there's the Zoom lady. Welcome. Thank you guys for coming to the Science by the Sea seminar. Thank you for coming early. We're going to sit tight for a couple minutes as we wait for people to come into the Zoom room. And while we wait, we would love to know where you are joining us from. So tell us in the chat where you are joining the seminar series from. And I can tell you too. I am in Honolulu, Oahu. Mahalo for joining us early. So for folks that just came in, we are getting set up. We're waiting for people to join us in the Zoom room. We're super excited to have all of you. We have some great talks today. And while we wait for other folks to join us here, we'd love to know where you are joining from. So let us know in the chat where you're logging in from today. Wow, we have Kamakura, Japan, Santa Barbara, California, Hilo, Hawaii, Manoa, Mililani, Berkeley, lots of different places. Haiku, this is excellent. Thank you for joining us. Welcome everyone. Thank you for logging in early. We're gonna wait another minute for people to come into the Zoom room. We are expecting lots of different people today, but we'd love to know where you're logging in from. So if you can tell us in the chat where you are sitting and logging into this virtual space from, we'd love to hear from you. And we have quite a diverse audience today, people logging in from international locations, from the continent, from various islands in Hawaii. Please let us know in the chat where you're logging in from. Okay, it is 12:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, aloha, thanks for joining us. This is the Science by the Sea seminar. My name is Maya Walton. I work at Hawaii Sea Grant as Assistant Director for Research and Fellowships. We're super excited to kick off this seminar series with 4 amazing speakers. They are all Sea Grant Graduate Fellows or PICAS Graduate Scholars. Their graduate research is being supported, funded by Sea Grant and PICAS. PICAS stands for the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center. So in a minute, we're going to introduce our speakers and hear about their research results, hear about the projects that they are completing. A couple housekeeping things. You'll notice that we are recording the seminar series, and that's because there are a couple folks who won't be able to join us in real time who'd like to visit the recording later on their own. So please be aware that we are recording the webinar series. And the other housekeeping item is I'd like to tell you a little bit about the format. So we're going to have a series of 3 talks today. First, we're going to hear from Hawaii Sea Grant Graduate Fellows Ireland Castillo and Jojo Briones. Their talk is titled Into the Future, Looking at Waikiki, Hawaii with Sea Level Rise. That'll be our first talk. We'll take 1 question in between every talk, so you can enter your questions into the chat as we go along. I'm going to give you a preview of all the 3 talks. So the second talk will be from Sea Grant Graduate Fellow, PICAS Graduate Scholar, Gina McGuire. Her talk is titled The Secret in the Soil. And we're going to close out the seminar series today with Anna McCormick's talk. She's a PICAS Graduate Scholar and Sea Grant Graduate Fellow. Her talk is titled In the Zone, How Salinity Research Can Aid Native Hawaiian Plants. I want to tell you a little bit about our Sea Grant Graduate Fellows. So again, these are graduate students who are completing research. The research is being funded by Sea Grant and PICAS, but these fellows are also receiving professional development training in science communication. So we've been spending time together and thinking about how to tell and share research results with non-technical audiences, with non-science audiences. The fellows have spent time thinking about how to share their research results in a creative format and an engaging format. So I'm super excited to see what they have to share today. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. So thank you for those that are joining a little bit late. If you're here for the Science by the Sea series, you are in the right place. We have 3 amazing talks. And the other thing that we'd like you to remember is please do enter questions into the chat box, and we're going to take a question in between each of the talks as we go along. We have some time saved at the end for a longer Q&A, but we'd really appreciate if you enter your questions into the chat box as we go along. So we're going to bring Ireland and Jojo up to the Zoom podium, and we're going to hand the mic off to them. And whenever you guys are ready, you can begin. That looks great. We can see your slides in full.
Okay, thank you, Maya. Aloha, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our talk into the future, looking at Waikiki, Hawaii with sea level rise. My name is Jojo.
And my name is Ireland.
And we're a team from the Environmental Design Lab at the School of Architecture from UH Manoa. And we're researching sea level rise and its effects on Waikiki and the ways in which the built environment might adapt with these changes. So today we wanted to revisit the goals of our project, which are to 1, create a design brief that would include site info, built environment adaptation best practices, etc., which have been done. And number 2, design and visualize these adaptation methods for Waikiki, a goal we're still working to achieve. And 3, most importantly, engage community stakeholders throughout this process. An example of this is what we've worked on this past summer.
So last summer, we and our team had hosted 4 outreach committee workshops where you met with different stakeholders investing in Waikiki. These people included professionals in various fields, city officials, educators, and etc. We presented a series of adaptation strategies that we thought applicable to Waikiki and tested their knowledge and gathered feedback via survey during these meetings. For example, in our stakeholder outreach meetings, we synthesized a series of adaptation strategies related to buildings. So in this case, we looked at strategies like elevating on fill, relocating critical systems above elevations where water is expected, and dry flood proofing as means to protect the building. We analyzed 3 existing building conditions, which included 1, below grade occupied spaces and/or parking, 2, at grade occupied spaces, and 3, above grade occupied spaces. For example, in one of the slides from our presentation, we identified 2 examples of buildings from Waikiki that have below grade occupied spaces and/or parking. You might recognize some of these spaces as your typical hotel/condo tower typology with below grade parking, shown in the top image, and the type of below-grade commercial spaces similar to those at Discovery Bay Center along Ala Moana Boulevard in the bottom image. In this way, what is highlighted in blue speculates at-risk building openings and the flow of water if floodwaters were to move into the building. We then provided a series of actions that might be recommended for this type of building condition to adapt to sea level rise as seen on the left. We also looked at adaptation strategies related to open spaces, which include A, the use of cisterns and water collection, B, the concept of using floodable open spaces, and C, what we're terming ecological water treatment when describing the type of capture and reuse of water on site. And the types of spaces that we were looking at for Waikiki, Hawaii included landscape areas and/or parks, for example, Fort DeRusi as seen in the picture, parking areas, and vacant lots. In addition, we looked at adaptation strategies related to transportation, looking at ways in which the possibility of A, elevating the streets, roads, and sidewalks, and B, creating what the city has termed a resilient streetscape transition zone for the health, productivity, and protection of pedestrians is applicable. In this case, we identified major roads such as Kalakaua Avenue, Alawai Boulevard, Ala Moana Boulevard, and Kupio Avenue as roads that potentially will need to change in the future with sea level rise. Lastly, we looked at adaptation strategies related to utilities. For example, we looked at the possibility and need to A, elevate critical equipment, B, protect and replace city utilities, and C, incorporate potential below grade water storage. Some examples of the type of utilities which we are describing are the type of utility/junction boxes that you observe on the street, underground utilities in Waikiki that you don't see, and large public service areas that are nestled in parts of Waikiki.
As we moved into the next phase of our project, we wanted to implement these strategies for various buildings in Waikiki and render these scenarios for the years 2050 and 2100 with expected sea level rise of 2 and 6 feet accordingly. In this way, we relied on sea level rise projection data from PAC-IUS and NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer. In addition, we looked at data like Honolulu City and County's land use ordinance or zoning, FEMA's flood hazard maps, and building typologies, etc., to help us narrow our focus. Using this data, we developed a criteria that helped us determine 5 sites to show building adaptations in various locations. Some of the criteria we used were areas that we observed to flood the soonest or had outdated buildings that would likely experience significant change over time. And more specifically, we studied all the building typologies in Waikiki, so to make sure that we captured the essence and character of different structures. So for example, our first site is a study of a typical 3-story residential walk-up with at-grade spaces. And this example is shown along Alawai Boulevard in West Waikiki. And the second is a Mauka site, also along Alawai Boulevard. Its characteristics are a podium typology with parking below grade and a residential tower. Third, we have another site in Waikiki, West Waikiki, along Ala Moana Boulevard, for example, looking at Discovery Bay Center with below grade commercial spaces, which is most vulnerable to any types of flood scenario. And the fourth site is along Kalakaua Avenue, located centrally in Waikiki. At this site, there are frequent low-rise commercial spaces, and though it's not necessarily a site that floods the soonest, we thought it might be important to address the most active retail corridor in Waikiki for the future. Then lastly, we chose a Makai site at Fort Tarusi Beach Park adjacent to Castle Waikiki Shore and the Outrigger Resort near Kalia Street.
So currently, we are in the process of tying all parts of our research and process into the creation of these 3D renderings in order to help people like you understand and visualize what it means for a building to adapt to sea level rise. In the next slides, we'll be sharing draft versions of these renderings, which we are still currently working on. Our goal is to show a succession of images that help visualize an existing condition, 2050 and 2100 scenario with possible adaptation strategies. For example, what we've done is create a 3D model of Waikiki. So what you're seeing in the bottom left photo is a photo in real life, and the larger image represents the 3D model, which we are currently working on. Here we're looking at West Waikiki along Alawai Boulevard at existing conditions, and the red line represents the current street elevation. In this next image, we're looking at West Waikiki along Alawai Boulevard at 2050 with 2 feet of sea level rise plus a king tide scenario if no actions were taken. In this way, with just 2 feet of sea level rise, we can see that the streets begin to flood, which is a problem for cars, transportation, utilities, and eventually the buildings themselves. And what we're doing now is by using our 3D model, we can model new changes to these buildings and show different adaptation strategies. For example, by 2050, we can expect and show that these buildings might be adapted by elevating on fill and where we might show the relocation of critical systems for these buildings. This is something we are currently working through as we look in the designs of these areas at both the building and urban scale.
Similar to what Ireland just presented in the previous site, here are renderings shown for another site, which is the Mauka Waikiki along Alawai Boulevard. The image on the bottom left again reminds us of what the building looks like with current conditions, as well as the render showing us the current conditions. And then the red line representing the existing street elevation. And with these existing conditions, we've been able to map and project the future sea level rise. This helps us determine the vulnerabilities of the building. Shown in the render is the water level of a 2050 scenario with 2 feet of sea level rise and a king tide at 2050, indicated by the white dashed line. For this 2050 scenario, if nothing is done, the street will be flooded almost every day, an inundation causing flooding in this below grade space shown on the left. The next slide shows the potential building adaptation strategies like elevating on fill, building with flood resistant materials, reevaluating spaces below the DFE, as well as relocating critical systems. So the framework of this process so far, and as it continues, is based on this recursive structure that deals with balancing science, community, and design. And with this, we're able to better understand the application for our project and work with others to create better solutions. And with that, we want to conclude with our acknowledgements for our whole team working on this project, our PI, Wendy McGuire, our co-investigator, Chip Fletcher, as well as some key personnel, Dolan Eversole, Eileen Peppard, and the architecture students from an elective course that helped develop some of the materials for this project. Mahalo, everyone, and thank you for your attention today. And thank you to Sea Grant for hosting these amazing community outreach events where we can show the progress of our project.
Thank you.
Thank you. Applause for Jojo in Ireland. I can see people clapping in their Zoom boxes. I see the clapping emoji. Great job. If you have a question for our speakers, please enter it into the chat. We're going to take one question as we bring Gina McGuire up to the Zoom stage. I have a question for you guys. So you have selected these sites to do these renderings. Is part of your research process going to be sharing your research results with the building owners or the residents or the shop owners in these buildings? Tell us about outreach connected to your research.
Yeah, so with these next set of renderings, our hope is to get them out into the community. So kind of the same people we had surveyed in our first outreach event, to reach out to them again and to get their second kind of round 2 feedback. And eventually what will happen is with all of the stuff that we've done up to this point will be compiled into a document. But that's kind of the end goal, be all goal at the end.
Fantastic. We have another question from Brad. Brad, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, glad to. Thanks, Maya. Great presentation. It's really closely related to the last question, but I'm just wondering if you're in touch with city planners or folks related to them at all, and if if they're looking at your results or any chance you'll be able to get the results when you're done.
Yeah, so from our community outreach that we just did this past summer, we actually worked with a lot of city officials, planners included, and we're all kind of working towards that same goal. So sharing the resources is really important among their group and our group. And so we've been working with them collaboratively and trying to make it more effective by doing that. So yes, we're trying to share as much as we can to get the most applicable results in the end.
I see a thumbs up from Brad. Wow, we really appreciate you extending those research results to these different users and stakeholders. Thanks, Jojo and Ireland. Another round of applause for your talk. Thank you so much. We're gonna bring Gina up to the Zoom stage. And I want to spotlight Gina's camera for everyone. Okay, Gina, your slides look good and you can start whenever you like.
Thank you so much, Maya, and thank you so much, Sea Grant, for having this wonderful opportunity. That was also Ireland and Jojo. I'm so impressed by your guys' graphics and research. So thank you so much for sharing. My talk is very vaguely titled The Secret in the Soil, but it is a portion of a wider research project that I've been able to be a part of as a Sea Grant and PICASC fellow. So I wanted to start by saying thank you, as the project that I'm a part of sits on so many shoulders and collaborators. Sea Grant, PICASC, Kako'oiwi, which is a nonprofit organization in Hei'a, the botany department, the geography department, UHero, just a really wonderful group of people that I feel really blessed to have been able to have the opportunity to work with. The picture in the background is of our agroforestry site that we're, I say we, but I'm on Big Island, but our team is actively working to restore in Hei'a on Oahu. I wanted to start a little bit by talking about my background. I'm always interested in speakers, where they come from and why they were drawn to their research. And so these are just a wide variety of photos. The one on the left is from Australia. The one in the middle is from Kalapana on Hawai'i Island, where my doctoral work and dissertation focus area is. And then the one on the right is just of from when I was in the La'au class. So that's kind of my background, is trying to do specifically coastal ecology, but thinking about bringing culture into how we do science, into how we manage land, and into sustainable, but also indigenous futures and knowledges together. So today I'm going to be talking about my work with soil. And so I've been really, I didn't realize, how much a part soil has been in my life until the past year, when I really started coming up with different ways to analyze it in our project. And so all the pictures on the left are from, I grew up on a farm on Hawai'i Island, and my dad grows maile. So thinking about, those kind of soils on our farm. The picture in the middle is from Hakalau National Wildlife Refuge, and planting native species out there. And then the one on the right, again, is from my time in Australia, but bringing all of that experience and interest and passions for conservation and reforestation into my current project space. So I wanted to show you guys a video to open you guys up into soil specifically. And this is just our puppy, and she digs random holes all over our farm, right? And you can't stop her. She's just fascinated with the soil. And so hopefully what I'm gonna bring to the table today is get you guys as interested and fascinated by soil as I have in the last year. It's, I don't know how to, there we go. So as I said, this portion of really specifically thinking about soils comes as part of a wider project looking at agroforestry restoration. And I just want to acknowledge all of my team members, specifically Leah Bremer over here, but just a really wide range of really wonderful people that I've had the opportunity to work with on this. And what we're all kind of working on is thinking about restoring lands across Hawaii, specifically our project site in Hei'a that I mentioned earlier, but to agroforest systems. And so agroforestry is a really broad category. So if you're like, I don't know what that means, that's fair. It means a lot of different things. And so it's any land use system that integrates trees and crops together, which includes things like livestock, cattle and trees together, for example, as we're seeing on ranches in Hawaii, but also things like, everything from windbreaks and riparian buffers to a multi-storied, culturally stewarded forest site. So we're really thinking about integrated and diverse crop and tree systems together. Historically, agroforest systems prior to contact supported a really large number of people, actually greater than the wetland lo'i kalo agricultural systems in Hawaii. And so this map that I'm showing here is actually highlighting areas that Dr. Natalie Kurashima and Dr. Tamara Tickton put together. They were highlighting areas of traditional agriculture prior to contact. So there's this really great legacy for agroforest systems in Hawaii that we want to advocate for and restore in available lands today. So our wider project's objectives are to really looking at the site scale. So we have the active restoration site at Pu'ulani, which is within Heia in Kaneohe on Oahu. And then looking at that Ahupua'a scale, but my work mostly focuses on the geospatial wider statewide analysis of, so looking at these indigenous systems and modern agroforestry systems, where can we actually envision future restoration of these land use management tools? And so we're really looking at what I'm talking about today is really focusing on the terrestrial side of really thinking about soil specifically, which is, you know, a narrow lens within this wider project and vision. But we're really focused also, a different part of the project is thinking about how this restoration has widespread implications and benefits for things like the reef, right? So when we're thinking about sediment retention, when we're thinking about nutrients and you know, land use management practices that are going to also benefit the nearshore ecosystem, that's another benefit for agroforest practices. So my work in designing these scenarios we're mostly focusing on lands that were historically in high intensity agriculture systems, but also the footprints of these indigenous agroforest sites is really working in collaboration. I have Zoe Hastings, who just defended her dissertation successfully. It's really exciting. So I do most of the spatial modeling, but what Zoe did is she actually interviewed people who are doing this today, who are actively doing agroforestry restoration and management to come up with these scenarios that we're implementing. So the idea is that at the statewide level, we can take these agroforestry restoration scenarios and we can identify hotspots or trade-off areas where, okay, maybe we're seeing ecosystem services for groundwater recharge or food. I also include materials because there's medicinal plants or timber and things like that. Or we're seeing increased biodiversity by having this really diverse agricultural system as opposed to maybe a monocrop system. And sediment retention, marine biodiversity, where are we going to get the most benefit out of restoring these agroforest systems? So what I'm talking about today is a really small lens of the soil carbon story of the benefit for restoring these systems. And soil carbon is one of the main soil health indicators, right? So it affects the soil structure, ability to hold nutrients, and it's influenced, you can see on the left, the picture that I've shown here is really, there's a wide diversity of soils in Hawaii, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But soil carbon is that main indicator of soil health. So it's affecting water storage, carbon capture, biological function, and productive capacity. And so when we have really high intensive agricultural systems, they can strip the soil of that carbon. And so identifying where are we going to see the highest benefit to that soil carbon under an agroforestry restoration. So like I said, there's quite a few different soils in Hawaii, and I want to encourage everybody, if you're interested in soil, to check out the Hawaii Soil Atlas resource. You guys can see the maps that I'm talking about for yourselves, and you can look at all different kinds of things like pH, acidity, fertility, which is the mineralogical class. But yeah, so the idea when we went into this was what we really wanted to understand is not so much a quantitative or a number, like what exactly is going to be the level of carbon, right? But whether we were going to see an increase or a decrease under an agroforest management scenario. And so one of the first steps that we needed to take was to identify the different soil types in Hawaii. And so this is directly from the Hawaii Soil Atlas. They have all of this wonderful information available. Soil carbon is dependent on things like climate, so like how much rainfall you're getting. On these different soil types, their mineralogical class, they behave differently when you do different land use transitions to them. And it is that really that history of agricultural intensity and production that becomes really important for us in understanding soil carbon. So when we're looking at a map of the Hawaii Island or the Hawaiian Islands, right? So first we need to identify, is it a wet climate, dry climate, or mesic, and have that information. And then we need to identify, okay, what is that fertility? Is it an andesol? Is it an inceptisol? And where does it fall within this mineralogical class? Because they behave differently. And then we're bringing in land use history, right? So at the top, this is just like a really quick, I'm in the process of updating this at the moment. And so it's really underworks, right? But we're asking for each different, spot that we're considering for our scenarios, what are these classifications? And so the one that becomes really important, again, is that land use transition. And so thinking about specifically the picture on the right, in Hawaii, we have had a really long history of intensive monocrop plantation style agricultural production, which has really dramatic implications for the erosion of the soil, that whenever it rains, being swept down into the nearshore environment, also stripping the soil of that carbon and its nutrients, really high intensive fertilizer and herbicides being used. And so what we did and what we're doing is using the agricultural baseline for the Hawaiian Islands have been conducted. And so looking at 1978, what was this land? Was it in production? Was it in a high intensity production or low intensity? And really watching the legacy of that land use over time for the last 40 years. And then envisioning, okay, so if we, rehabilitate this land, which has been stripped of all of these soil properties, and we transition it to something more diverse, more, you've got more leaf litter, really restoring that soil carbon potential. What does that look like? And so predicting that's the model that we're currently working on. And so this is a draft, this map that I'm showing you guys. But the idea is to really identify, this is looking at North Maui, but looking at, where can we really say that we're going to see a high transition in the soil carbon potential? And then our plan is to put this back into conversation with all of those other range of benefits that I talked about earlier. So we can identify, yes, we're going to see we've got confidence in these green areas, right? This is where we might have previous high agricultural intensity paired with the right soil mineralogy, where we're really going to see, positive impact in the soil carbon. But maybe there's a trade-off with the groundwater restoration or with the nearshore environment. So putting all of these ecosystem benefits together to kind of assess, okay, this is really where we should focus our attention and we're going to see the most benefit. Or if we really care about, if we really care about food production for this particular community, that we know that that's the spot where we want to do it, regardless of the trade-offs maybe. But this is just to really inform that conversation. And so this has been really a process of putting together this, okay, yes, we have high intensity ag with an inceptisol, right? It's been a process of depending on the literature, because we do not have a lot of data available in Hawaii at the moment for soil to back up what happens to soil carbon. So first we're asking, okay, is there a Hawaii study that we already know for sure we're going to see a benefit? And then we have a really high confidence, and that's reflected in this map here. But if we don't have something in Hawaii and we don't have a tropics-based study that's suggesting the implications of our restoration, then we turn to global literature, right? Or is there something in a similar climate that we can look at? So that's been kind of the process, is filling out a really exhaustive literature search, as well as coming up with this really detailed workflow for what can we really say and how can we back it up. And so that's what I've been working on. And I'm in the middle of this. So this is really raw research that you guys are seeing. And so I will close there and ask if there's any questions. But again, thanking all of these organizations that have supported us, and thanking Sea Grant for making this outreach possible. It's wonderful to share what I've been working on.
Thank you, Gina. Applause for your talk. Thank you so much for your talk. I do see a question in the chat from Patty. Patty, would you like to ask your question out loud?
Sure, thank you. I'm just wondering, since what you described was based on prior and then comparisons to current nature of managing of agriculture, have you thought about or tried to project with regard to changes in the nature of rainfall that's expected for the islands, for instance, droughts alternating with great runoff from these more intense but intermittent storms that we're seeing today? How would that affect your restoration management into the future, over decades or toward the end of the century?
Thanks so much for your question, Patty. That's a really wonderful and relevant question. And what we're currently doing, so we have a couple different scenarios that we've been designing, largely based on the current climate. So we've got a different species list for this agroforestry scenarios, whether it's wet, mesic, or dry. But we also we're using our model. We're currently using the mid-century, so looking at 2050, but also adjusting these scenarios based on climate change projections for precipitation. So I think you bring up a really good point about these, weather events that can be really severe and dramatic. And that's something we haven't totally taken into account for, but we are doing future climate scenarios on, for the wet scenario, for example, is that amount of area going to shrink in the future? And it's looking like, the dry agroforest systems are going to be expanding. And that's a really wonderful question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the talk. It was great. Thank you very much.
Okay, we will take Scott's question. I know there are many questions in the chat, but we're going to take the question from Scott, and then we'll transition to Anna's talk. Scott, would you like to ask your question out loud?
Sure. Super great talk. Thanks, Gina. I was just wondering, you mentioned integrating an integrated and diverse agroforestry effort, which is super exciting. I just thought in such diverse landscapes culturally, it might be a natural to link that your efforts with soil carbon and the stories of land use change with cultural values and the way that those cultures perceive and hold knowledge toward the soil, sort of spatially and in such a culturally diverse state as Hawaii, in both rural and urban arenas. Is there any interest in that or ideas that you might have in that regard?
Thanks so much for that question, Scott. So I realized I totally skipped this slide somehow, but I was meaning to bring in a little bit more of the culture and talk about a specifically Hawaiian, cosmology and understanding of soil, which has been really informing our work. And I think in the future, so Zoe, who I mentioned, Zoe Hastings, just published a paper in her conversations with agroforestry practitioners who, they're not actually prioritizing their land management necessarily, and they need to make a living, right? But they're not choosing to be farmers or choosing to have agroforests based on like an economic decision, right? It comes really down to those cultural values or what they value as a farmer and having a more integrated practice. So I do think that there's a lot of area for this. And I think Zoe is really carrying the torch on this area, but really wonderful question. Something I'd like to do more of is really bringing the cultural to this space. So thank you for that, Scott.
Oh, awesome. No, that's great to hear. It's just, there's a sky's the limit with thinking of the diversity of practitioners and the vast spectrum of cultures that they represent in knowledge too. And it just is exciting. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott.
Fantastic. We're going to bring Gina to the Zoom stage. I mean, not Gina, Anna to the Zoom stage. I might need a second cup of coffee. Anna, let's bring your slides up.
Great. Okay. I'll just get myself situated here. You just give me a thumbs up when that pops up.
Yes, we can see your slides now. That looks great.
Okay. Thanks very much. So super hard to follow you guys. It's really interesting, and I feel like all of these projects, like we're all touching on elements of similar things related to climate change and changing events. So this talk's kind of similar, I suppose, in that vein. So thank you very much for coming. My name is Anna. I'm a second-year master's student here at UH. And today I'd like to talk to you about the work I've been doing with my supervisor, Dr. Casey Barton, in the School of Life Sciences here at UH. And we have collaborations with NTBG out on Kauai, and we took this stunning photo, and the Maui Nui Botanical Gardens. And we've been working on assessing salinity tolerance or salt tolerance in both native and invasive plant species here in Hawaii, specifically for coastal plants. And we're trying to mimic climate change settings in the greenhouse to examine how well or how poorly plants may tolerate these potential increases in salt concentration. And as I'm sure you're aware, out here in Hawaii, we're approximately 2,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass, making it some of the most isolated islands in the world. And there's about approximately 1,400 plant taxa that are considered native, with 90% of these plants found nowhere else on Earth. And with about 750 miles of combined coastline, the plants found in these coastal ecosystems here in Hawaii have essential ecological contributions, where they have critical roles in providing shore stabilization, as well as fostering biodiversity. And they additionally act as a front line of defense against approaching weather systems. And with an increasingly uncertain climate, species will most certainly be lost without concerted conservation efforts. And these coastal dune plants also provide food sources for native bees and birds, and they also create nesting habitats for birds and sea turtles. And they're also areas of recreation and cultural resources, with the benefits of conserving and protecting native plants therefore extending to the surrounding community and aiding the preservation of valuable natural resources. And the habitat that we are most interested in our studies is the supertidal zone, or the area above the high tide zone, or the splash spray zone. And it's this area here that I'm pointing to. And little is known about how Hawaiian coastal plants may tolerate changes in salinity exposure, and if this tolerance is greater in invasive species. So understanding how the ecological landscape might change as we move into a more climatically uncertain future will be important for preserving some of these critically endangered plant communities. And the plants in this area are currently experiencing habitat loss due to sea level rise and beach erosion. And they're experiencing higher levels of exposure to salt water with more frequent king tides and storm surges than they would have in the past, more saltwater intrusion and inundation. And we classify vulnerability as the inability of a species to exhibit a response necessary for persistence under climate change. And it's important to consider that these plants are experiencing decreasing freshwater rainfall events, as well as experiencing this higher exposure to storm surge events. And so it's a combination of these factors which is leading to a greater accumulation of salts in the root systems of plants. And it's unclear how climate change is affecting the habitat of these coastal dune species. So we're asking the question, can dune plants tolerate increasing salinity? And I've been carrying on from some previous work done in the lab, where salinity tolerance was examined in the dune species you'll see here. And I can try to pronounce some of these Hawaiian names. I think this is Pahu Ohikiaka and Elima. And these experiments were done at multiple stages of the plant's life cycle, and provided the rationale for our current focus here on seedling and on juvenile phases of development. And the prediction from this work was that while these plants can tolerate periods of salinity, they cannot tolerate persistent exposure to high salinity, as they're typically freshwater plants due to their location in these areas above the high tide zone most typically. So our aim is to assess how salinity exposure may influence Hawaiian coastal plant communities. And we're performing these experiments on native as well as non-native coastal species. And we're doing these experiments in the greenhouse where we're mimicking these storm surge events by treating plants with a saltwater solution. And with the goal being to identify vulnerable species, which may require more intensive management for conservation, also to identify tolerant species, which may be used for restoration purposes, and as well to gain an insight into how non-native species may pose a threat to native species as the ecosystem continues to change with sea level rise. And as I mentioned, we have collaborations with NTBG on Kauai and Maui Nui Botanical Gardens, and they've been providing us with all of the seed stock that's been used for this work and sampling from wild populations on both islands. And these are some examples of the native species for the project. So you might recognize some of these just being around on the beach. So the ma'os or the gossypiums, akiki is the Fembristilus, nanea is the Vigna marinas, yeah, I can't pronounce the rest of the Hawaiian names, but you get an idea anyway that we're trying to have as diverse a species selection as possible in order to gain a general understanding of how plant communities may respond at large to these changing conditions. And dune plant communities are, at least for now, still largely dominated by native species, whereas in contrast, the same cannot be said for some more lowland areas where invasive species have mostly taken over. And these are some examples of the invasive species. And you might recognize the helicoas or the castorinas, the ironwoods. These are commonly seen here on Oahu anyway. And as I mentioned, the seeds used for this work came from wild populations here within the state of Hawaii and were kindly provided to us through our collaborators. And so upon arrival of the seeds, they're placed in these flat trays where they germinate. We then transplant the seeds into these 1 gallon pots, as you see here, where we have a mixture of promix, sand, and cinder to mimic the substrate conditions of the coastal dunes. And once the plants are established, we then split them into 2 groups. So we're examining salinity tolerance at 2 distinct phases of development. At the seedling stage, an example on the top here with 4 to 6 true leaves, and the juvenile phase, about 10 to 12 true leaves. And we're examining these 2 phases in the plant's growth and development in order to investigate how seedling establishment on coastal dunes may be affected by climate change. And this is important as high sensitivity in the early phase of a plant's life could potentially lead to population collapse, as the stability of the population depends on seedling establishment. And in this experiment, we're trying to mimic climate change by reproducing the conditions that the plants in these coastal habitats may experience due to more frequent storm surge events and king tides. And to achieve this, we examine the response of a control group, which is watered with fresh water for the duration of the experiment, to a treatment group, which received a saltwater solution. In our case, we're actually using a marine salt solution to recapitulate seawater. And so taking this approach, we can introduce a greater concentration of salt into the substrate and examine how the plants respond. And this is just an example here, a very clear difference in growth between the 2 treatments, with the saltwater treated plants showing very poor tolerance in this case. So as I mentioned, plants are treated with a marine salt solution to mimic ocean surges, and this is done for a 3-week period. And the plants then enter a 2-week recovery phase where they're watered daily with fresh water. And this is so that we can examine what's the ability of the plants to recover following a resupply of fresh water. And at the end of the experiment, we harvest for the plant's biomass, the leaves, the roots, and the shoots. And we can then weigh this biomass to gain insights into how salinity treatments affect the plant's growth and development. So what does salinity tolerance look like? So it may help to think of this as a gradient, where if the saltwater treatment group survive and grow the same as freshwater, we regard this as having high tolerance. So here you can see an example of a highly tolerant species. And there seems to be no difference between the control group versus the saltwater treated group here. To a more moderately tolerant species like the ma'os, where there's a visible reduction in growth and health of the plants. However, importantly, they are still growing. And to another species then, which exhibits a very low tolerance, such as the plumbagos, zolanicas, or the ihilehes, and where there's no plants that survive this treatment. And we're defining salinity tolerance as the persistent survival and growth in the presence of salt water. And we can determine this by comparing the response that we see in the saltwater treated plants to their respective control groups. And our metrics for this assessment are the percent survival and the percent change in biomass. So examining the change in plants biomass, here I'll just focus your attention to the ma'os response, where we're seeing even across this selection of species here with seedlings in blue and the juvenile stages in red, that the seedling stages are always less tolerant than the juvenile stages. So these blue points are obviously presenting lower than these red points. However, all of the data points here are below this 0 line here. And this tells us that even with the variability that we see across species, no species can tolerate this increase in salinity without growth being affected, with the most tolerant species here being the Chenopodiums and the Fimbristalis that I've just highlighted here. And the biomass data for the helicoas as well, one of our invasive species, we see a large reduction in the percent growth relative to the controls and at both stages of seedling and juvenile. So this is showing a moderate response versus that of a very poor tolerant species, or the Nanaes or the Vignas. So our preliminary results, we're seeing generally poor salinity tolerance in the native plants tested so far, with high amounts of species variation. And we hope to bring all of the quantitative data together in order to be able to more accurately define a species' overall response and develop an understanding of the range of tolerance that we're seeing. At the moment, we're continuing the greenhouse experiments. So I have 14 species complete and another 13 to go. And we've also been working on a separate publication, which is a meta-analysis, where we've collected literature where salinity tolerance has been previously investigated in coastal species. And this covers many, many species and families of plants. And this gives us more of a global perspective on how coastal plants are likely to handle such rapidly changing climates. And if the response that we see in the Hawaiian plants is unique to them or indicative of a more global issue. And so just to say thank you very much to Sea Grant and UH for supporting my work, and to my mentor, Dr. Casey Barton, and all my lab mates for their support, as well as our collaborators out on NTBG on Kauai and Maui Nui. And it's been a fantastic opportunity to work out here in Hawaii. I'm a long way from home, originally hailing out of Ireland. So it's just been a really great opportunity. So thank you very much for the time and for your attention. I'm more than happy to take questions.
Thank you, Anna, for your talk. Applause for the talk that you shared. Thank you so much. If people have questions for Anna, please drop them into the chat. There's some comments coming in. Really interesting results. Can't wait to see how the other 13 species turn out.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting when the full panel is complete. I'll have a much better gauge on what kind of trends we're seeing and who's more likely to be most at risk.
Fantastic. We'll wait for questions to come in from the audience. In the meantime, I'd love to ask you a question. With sea level rise on one side, and we have this development of the coastline on the other side, what do you think will happen to our native coastal plant species? Where can they go? What do you suspect will happen?
Gosh, I mean, I think a lot of it depends on what action is taken, right? And like who's listening to what. So, I mean, even just, watching Ireland and Jojo's, if these projections are what they are for 2050, like people are going to know in advance. So there is time. Although I do think that time is, it's not so far in the future that we should be in any way complacent. So I think that like these kinds of events and these kinds of like interdisciplinary approaches for solving these problems is probably the only way that we can mutually learn all these different things and implement them in then our respective areas. I don't know what will happen, I hope the best for the best of things, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of work here, that there's a lot of people interested in native plants and making sure that populations are sampled from and that there are seed banks and seed stocks that are kept. And I hope that continues. And hopefully this work can contribute towards that awareness in a positive way.
Thanks, Anna. I see Brad has his hand up. Thank you for fielding my kind of big question. Great answer. Brad, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I don't have a question as much as a comment. I'm just really struck by how applicable, immediately needed this information is from your work, Anna, and the other two presentations we heard. It's really exciting to see this work that's probably directly applied to planning and management across all three talks. And Anna, for example, I think, we're anxiously awaiting the result of your work and Dr. Barton's ongoing work for guidance we're developing at Sea Grant for how to better restore coastal dunes, and even ongoing planning for dune restoration on the North Shore of Maui. So everybody keep up the great work. Thank you.
Cheers, appreciate that.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to spotlight all of our presenters, and we can open up for questions for any of the three talks that you saw from our four presenters. So let me bring the spotlights on them, bringing Gina back and Jojo back and Ireland back. Let's see. We do have a question in the chat. Rachel, would you like to ask your question out loud?
Sure.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So I preface this by saying this is potentially a not very PC kind of question, but if indeed some invasive species prove better suited to being able to withstand the conditions that come with sea level rise, in order to help preserve the coastline, should we consider letting those spread? Or is that really just completely counterproductive?
I mean, I know, so I guess it depends on how much you can control the spread, right? And like, and how much utility they're gonna bring to the table. So this, I mean, this is an approach that's taken for restoration, like where non-native species are used in focused areas for that very purpose, because of the service they provide. I think really it's a matter of management. I don't think it's non-PC. I think, these species might definitely have utility. And just may be careful on how we manage them and how we apply it. Hopefully that answers.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions from our audience? Before we leave, I definitely want to give all of our speakers another round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing your research results with us today. And what we will close with is we have more talks coming, not next week because we have a holiday on Thursday, but you can join us again on Thursday, November 18th at 12 p.m. We have three great talks. One from Crispin Nakoa and Shayla Waikiki on identifying sewage hotspots along the Hilo coastline. Marcus Peng is going to talk about what's a beach day worth, economic valuation of Waikiki Beach. And the third talk on the 18th will be from Nick Vanderzil. He's going to share his experiences from an oceanographic research cruise, 4,000 meters under the sea, life on an oceanographic research cruise. So we hope that you can join us on the 18th. Thank you so much for coming today. And we hope that you have a great Thursday. That's it for today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Maya. Appreciate it.